Hi, and welcome to BFG Photography. This is a beginner video for Photoshop. If you're new to Photoshop or would just like a quick refresher on some of the basics, then this video is for you. If you're a little more advanced, you might want to check out some of my other videos, such as the one that I have linked in the description below. The topics to be covered in this video are also in the outline in the description. If you'd like to skip to a particular topic, just use the timestamps and click on the beginning time for that particular topic. If you'd like to follow along using the same file that I use in this video, then click on the link in the description below. And with that, let's get started. This is early 2023 when I'm recording this video, so I'm using Photoshop version 24.1.1, sometimes referred to as Photoshop 2023. Now let's talk briefly about some of the main file types for photos that you're likely to come across. There are many different file types with different characteristics, different file extensions with names like JPEG, RAW, PNG, etc. It's like entering another world. In fact, let this be a warning. Your next stop, the file type zone. Well, I had prepared an entire section of this video that explained file type formats, but after recording it and watching it, I found that it was too long and too detailed for a beginner video. So instead, I removed that section of the video and simply placed a link to a PDF file in the description. This is a two-page document that provides a high-level overview of some of the more common file types. I hope you find the document useful. If you have any questions about any of the file formats, please ask them in the comments section below, and I will try to answer all your questions. With that background out of the way, let's open our practice file. The link for this file is in the description just below the video. Now, once you've downloaded and saved the file on your computer, you can open it in Photoshop by clicking on the Open button here, and then double-clicking on the file. And your screen should look something like this. Before we start editing the file, let's set up our workspace so that it will be easier to follow along. Since I'm a photographer, I use the Photography workspace in Photoshop. Select Window, Workspace, Photography. Go back again and select Window, Workspace, Reset Photography. That should reset all of these windows over here to look somewhat like this. Now, you won't have these particular files in your library. Don't worry about that. We don't need any of those files for this video. First, we need to be able to manipulate the photo on screen. If you press Ctrl+ on a PC, Command+ on a Mac, you can see that we zoom in on the file. Likewise, if you press Ctrl or Command-, we zoom out. If you'd like to fit the image on the screen, press Ctrl-0 or Command-0 on a Mac. If you'd like to zoom the image all the way into 100%, so you're basically looking at the pixel level, press Ctrl-1 on a PC or Command-1 on a Mac. Which brings us to the next required function, how to move the picture on the screen. To move the picture, click over here on the hand, then click and drag with the hand so that you can move the picture on the screen. Now I'm going to click Ctrl-0 or Command-0 on a Mac to go back to filling the screen with the image. We should crop the photo so that the bird fills more of the photo. There's too much dead space out here, as you can see. Notice that if I hover over the crop tool, this is the crop tool here. If I hover over the crop tool, it tells me the name of the tool. It gives an explanation of what it does, and it also shows in that square a shortcut key. Shortcut key in this case is C. So I could either click on this tool, or without being over on the toolbar, I could press C on the keyboard, and that brings up the crop tool. Now your screen might look slightly different from mine if your crop tool parameters are set up slightly differently. Let's look at some of the options. First, select the Clear button on top to clear out any prior options in these three boxes. Now in the first box is a drop-down, and the first option is Ratio. And Ratio does exactly what it sounds like. It crops the file in a ratio equal to whatever you enter for the width in this box and the height in this box. Let's say, for example, you wanted to crop this photo to fit an 8x10 frame. In that case, you'd want the width to be 10 inches and the height to be 8 inches. So we type in 10 for width and we type in 8 for height. Notice that the crop area now is slightly smaller than the entire photo. That's because the full frame sensor is a little bit wider than 8 by 10, so this area here on the left in the shaded area is not going to be part of the cropped picture, and likewise this area on the right is not going to be part of the cropped picture. Now I don't want to turn this video into a math lesson, but because this option is only concerned with the ratio, I could have entered any numbers with a ratio of 10 to 8 and the crop square would look and function exactly the same. For example, instead of 10 wide by 8 high, I could have put 5 wide by 4 high, and the crop area would look and function exactly the same. So remember, it's the ratio of the width and the height that is important in this particular option. Now let's look at some of the other options that are available. Width, height, and resolution. In this option, we're specifying not only width and height, but the actual resolution in terms of pixels per inch or pixels per centimeter. For example, if I crop 10 inches wide by 8 inches tall with a 300 pixel per inch resolution, my file would be 10 times 300 or 3000 pixels wide and 8 times 300 or 2400 pixels high. So in this way, we're specifying not only width and height, but the actual final dimensions of the file. Let's go back and look at some of the other options. There are 5 typical ratios here that can be set up automatically. For example, here's our 8 by 10 or 4 by 5. And you'll notice when I click on that, it comes up in the portrait orientation. That is, its height is larger than its width. If we wanted, instead of 4 by 5, if we wanted to have 5 wide and 4 high, we click on these double arrows here and the numbers swap automatically. So each time I click on these double arrows, I switch from portrait orientation to landscape orientation. Some of the other options include 5 by 7, 4 by 6, which would be typical of a full frame sensor. 16 by 9 would be typical of a high-definition television or a computer monitor. Let's go back and select original ratio. What that means is that the width and height ratios will be set up to be exactly the same as the current image that you're editing. So the crop area fills the entire image. Now let's see what happens when we click and drag the handles. If I click and drag this top handle, you can see the crop area is getting smaller. The sides move in as well, so that the crop area retains the original ratio of the image. I can do the same thing by moving in the corners. Now if I want to move all 4 corners in simultaneously, I hold down the Alt key, click and drag any of the handles, and everything moves in simultaneously. If I want to move the picture within the crop area, I simply click on the image and click and drag to get it where I'd like it to be. If I click outside of the crop area, notice that the icon changes. If I click and drag, I can tilt clockwise and counterclockwise, like so. Now before I accept this crop, there's one more thing I'd like to point out, and that is the straighten option. If I click this icon, I can straighten the photo by clicking and dragging along a horizon. Now this particular photo doesn't have an obvious horizon line. However, these symmetrical circles, the little waves in the water, would typically be level from the photographer's perspective. So I can use those as a kind of a pseudo horizon. So let me click on the icon for straighten. I'll start at one end of the circular pattern and drag to the other end. And you can see that pattern is now level, and the image itself has been rotated slightly counterclockwise to level out the horizon. I'm going to make this just slightly larger, and I think I'm happy with that. I'm going to click this check mark to accept the crop. Now I'm going to press Ctrl or Command 0, and I'm filling the screen with my newly cropped image. Notice that I did not check the box for delete cropped pixels, so the entire image is still there until I save the file with the crop. So if I click on the image to bring up the crop area and zoom out a little bit, you can see the entire image is still there. If I had selected this box to delete cropped pixels, then those cropped pixels would have been deleted. Let's do that now and you'll see what I mean. I'll select this option. I'll click the check mark to accept the crop. Now if I go down here and click on the image to bring up the crop area again, all those cropped pixels have been deleted. I'm going to hit Control+. You can also use the crop tool in a more free-form method without having the crop area maintain a constant aspect ratio. To do this, simply click on the Clear button, which will set the crop method to ratio with the width and height boxes left blank. Now when I click and drag on any of the crop handles, I can crop in any aspect ratio I want. For example, I can pull the corner this way or down this way. And if I wanted to, I could crop a wide panorama of the bird. I'm going to click Ctrl or Command Z to undo that and recenter the photo. The last option that I would like to discuss is content-aware cropping. When this option is selected and your crop area extends outside the edges of the photo, Photoshop will automatically create content to fill those areas that were outside the original photo. I know, pretty cool, eh? Let's say, for example, I wanted to crop this in a 4:5 portrait ratio. You can see when I do that, I'm kind of cutting off parts of the bird. To include the entire bird, I could extend the crop to be above the photo, but there are no pixels up there. If I select Content Aware and click the check mark, wait a few seconds, Photoshop has automatically filled in water on the top part of the photo. Pretty amazing. Can I do that on the top and the bottom as well? Maybe not. Let's see what happens. I'm going to hit Ctrl-Z to back that out. Click on the image to bring up the crop again. This time I'm going to hold down the Alt key and expand the crop in both directions, both top and bottom. Click on the check mark. Wait a few seconds. All right, the top of the photo looks good again, but look what happened at the bottom. I'm not sure what that is. So the moral of the story is to be careful when you're using content-aware crop. It does a good job on repeating patterns like water, grass, bricks, and so forth. Maybe not so good on organic items like animals and people. Okay, I'm going to hit Ctrl-Z and Ctrl-0 to go back to my cropped image. And I think that's about enough on this topic because I'm assuming at this point that you've had about all the crop you can take. Okay, moving right along. Let's look at how we can adjust the image in terms of brightness, saturation, exposure, and so forth. If you've used Photoshop before, you probably have some idea of the adjustments that you can make by clicking on Image, Adjustments, and looking for adjustments over here in this drop-down. Brightness and contrast, levels, curves, exposure, and so forth. And that's fine. These are adjustments you can make to photos, but if you apply the adjustments in this manner, you're editing the pixels of the image directly. A better way to do this would be in a non-destructive manner by putting the adjustments in a separate adjustment layer. To do that, go over here. You probably have Libraries selected. Now click on Adjustments. And these icons come up. If you hover over each icon, you'll notice the same adjustments that we just saw in the drop-down menu. Brightness and contrast, levels, curves, exposure, and so forth. Let's click on one of these icons and create an adjustment layer. I'm going to click on Curves, and you'll notice down here in the Layers palette, I have a new layer called Curves 1. Now that's where all of the adjustments that we're going to make in the Curves tool will reside. The background layer with the original image information will be preserved. That also brings up a window with a histogram here that's very similar to the histogram on the top right of the screen. The histogram tells us how many pixels are at each brightness level, with the darkest pixels being charted at the left and the lightest pixels being charted on the right. This peak in the darker areas is most likely the wings of the bird and perhaps some of the dark pixels in this island. This very large peak in the middle is most likely the water, as the water takes up a large portion of the photograph. Now, if you're familiar with graphs of this type, the white diagonal line is a graph of the input on the x-axis versus the output on the y-axis. But all you have to know is that we can change the luminosity of different areas of the image by clicking and dragging on this white line. For example, I can click in the middle of this white line and drag up, and this will increase the luminosity in just about the entire image. At any point where this white curve is above the black diagonal line, pixels at that luminosity level are being adjusted to be brighter. Likewise, when I drag down on the white curve, the overall image becomes darker. At any point where the white curve is below the black diagonal line, pixels at that luminosity level are being adjusted to be darker. To turn on and off the preview of the impact of the curve, click on this eye icon here. Preview off, preview on. You can see the histogram move when I click the Preview Off button. It moves back to the original state. When I click Preview On, those peaks move to the left because those pixels are being made darker by this curve. To reset the curve, click this icon. One common use of the Curves tool is to change the contrast of the image. To increase the contrast, make the shadow areas even darker and the highlight areas even lighter. To do this, click here in the shadow area, drag down, click in the highlight area, and drag up. Notice that this creates a bit of an S-curve, and the contrast of the image has been increased significantly. Preview off, preview on. To decrease the contrast, do just the opposite. Click on the shadow area and drag the white curve above the black diagonal. Click in the highlight area and drag the white curve below the black diagonal. Notice that the contrast in the image has been decreased. Preview off, preview on. Now be careful when making these adjustments not to go too extreme. For example, if I push this way up and this way down, I end up with a flat line in this area, meaning that all of the pixels in this range of brightness are going to be assigned to the same level of luminance. And you'll lose all of the detail. Look at the detail that's been lost in the water, the bird's head, and so forth. Now, even a curve that's this bad can still be salvaged. How do we do that? Go down to the Curves area, click on the Curves layer, click on the opacity, drag to the left, change the opacity to about, 15%, and we now have only a small impact on the contrast. Preview off, preview on. So even a bad curve can be salvaged by changing the percent opacity of the curves layer. That's another good reason to use adjustment layers. Let's close that window, click on the Curves layer, drag it down to the trash can icon, and we're back to the original image. Now would be a good time to pause and hear a brief word from the sponsor of this video. Except, I don't have a sponsor. So, back to the video. Another way of adjusting photos, and the way I prefer, is to use Adobe Camera Raw or ACR. To do this non-destructively, let's create a copy of the background layer. Right-click on the background layer and select Duplicate Layer. You can type in a new name for the layer if you'd like, but I'm going to keep Background Copy. With the Background Copy layer selected, click on Filter, Camera Raw Filter. Wait a few seconds and that brings up a new interface with even more menu options. Don't worry, this is an introductory video, so this won't be a deep dive. I'll save that for a later video. For now, we'll just look at a few of the options. Open the Basic panel by clicking on Basic if it isn't already open. There are lots of sliders here. Let's just look at a few and see how they impact the image. If I click and drag on Temperature and drag to the right, the white balance becomes warmer. If instead I drag to the left, the white balance becomes cooler. To reset any of the sliders, double-click on the handle. You can also try using Auto White Balance to see if that gives a good white balance. In this case, I believe it looks a little too yellow. Another option is to click on the eyedropper and then click somewhere in the image that you believe should be neutral or gray. Let's try the gray part of the avocet's leg. That doesn't look too bad, and the adjustments are very small, so this is very close to the original white balance. Exposure will move the entire image either brighter or darker. Note the histogram changing as I move the slider to the left to decrease the exposure and to the right to increase the exposure. I suggest you click these icons at the shadow and highlight sides of the histogram in order to show a warning when clipping occurs. A white box indicates that the clipping warnings are activated. Clipping occurs in areas of the image that have been pushed so far towards shadow or highlight that we've lost all detail. For example, if I click the Highlights slider and move to the right, we can see the red clipping warning on the back of the bird. If I kept this setting, those red areas would be pure white and we would lose all detail in those areas. If you want to reset all of the sliders in the basic area, press and hold the Alt or Option key and click on Reset Basic. Now with so many options available here on so many sliders, one thing a beginner might try is to click on the Auto button. I don't always agree with the auto settings, but it sometimes provides a good starting point. So let's try it. In this case, we actually do have some clipping on the back of the bird. I believe there's a little bit too much contrast, so I'm going to cut that back a little bit. I'm also going to reduce the highlights to help get rid of some of that clipping. And I'll reduce the white to pull it back to almost no clipping whatsoever. Because the image is a bit darker now, I'm going to increase the overall exposure back to about 0, or back to about where it was when we started. And lastly, I'll increase the shadows a little bit to bring out some more detail in the shadow areas of the bird. Now let's take a look at vibrance and saturation. If I click and drag saturation to the right up to about, let's say 60, I get a nice blue hue in the water, which previously had been almost gray. But the feathers on the head and the neck of the bird are quite oversaturated. Let's reset the saturation slider. Now instead, if I move vibrance up to about 60, I get that nice blue hue in the water, but the feathers on the head and neck of the bird are not oversaturated. Vibrance increases saturation in the areas that are not very saturated, and it applies less increase in saturation to areas that are already saturated and to skin tones. This is very helpful for portraits. If you'd like to see the impact of the adjustments that we've made so far, you can click on this icon here, which will toggle from default settings to the adjusted settings. So this is before and this is after. Looks like somewhat of an improvement so far. The last adjustment we'll make in ACR is noise reduction. As a side note, there are some third-party noise reduction tools, such as Topaz Denoise, that do a better job of reducing noise. But for relatively small amounts of noise, Photoshop does a fine job. First, let's deselect the eyedropper tool so that we have the magnifying glass tool. Click about here in the photo so that we zoom in to 100%. Click on the Detail panel. Click the Noise Reduction slider and move it up to about 35 or so. We don't want to get rid of all of the noise. This gets rid of most of it. If we slide Noise Reduction all the way to the right, you can see how much detail we lose in the photo. Even though we've gotten rid of all the noise, we've lost too much detail. So let's move that back to about 35. Now even at this setting, we're losing a little bit of detail. You can see that especially in the eye area. So let's add some sharpening. Move that up to about 30 to 35. The problem is when we add sharpening, we're actually sharpening the noise down here in this area. So we use masking to control where sharpening will occur. While holding down the Alt or Option key, move the masking slider to the right to about 60. You'll see a black and white mask on screen. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and the mouse key so we can look at this mask. As with all masks, black conceals and white reveals. So sharpening will only occur in the white areas around the edges of the image. The water is nearly black, so the sharpening will not be applied to the water. Now I'm letting go of the mouse key. Click OK at the bottom of the Tools palette to accept all changes. And there we have changes using ACR or Adobe Camera Raw. This all occurred in the background copy. If I hide the background copy, we can see the original background with the original image. Let's turn the background copy back on. The last change we'll make is to remove some rough spots from the image. For this, we'll use the Spot Healing Brush tool. Click this icon on the toolbar, or simply press J on the keyboard. At the top, make sure the mode is set to normal, make sure the type is content aware, and uncheck the box for Sample All Layers. Now we should see a circle, which is the brush for the Spot Healing Brush tool. Use the brackets just to the right of the P on the keyboard to make the brush smaller or larger. Put the brush over this spot just in front of the bird's head. Click the left mouse button once, and the spot is gone. Out, damn spot. I think that's something Shakespeare once said to his dog after he tracked dirt in the house. Okay, in the bottom left-hand corner we have a few more spots. Let's make the brush tool a little larger by clicking the right bracket. Then click over the spot. Now even if we have a smaller brush, we can click and drag and make a larger circle and get rid of a spot in that manner. This tool works best on spots like these that are surrounded by similar background, but it will also work in other situations. For example, it's great for removing telephone lines from a photo. Okay, this looks pretty good. Now we need to save our work in a new file. If you'd like to save the layers in the file so they'll be available next time you open the file, you probably want to save it as a Photoshop file. However, I would like to save this file as a JPEG so that it will be more compatible with other applications. Everything is stored in one layer on a JPEG file, so a JPEG will basically store what you're seeing on the screen. In this case, it will be the background copy layer. If your Photoshop program is set up in a default manner, then when you click File, Save As, and then click on the Save As Type drop-down, you'll have a very limited number of options, and JPEG is not one of the options. To fix this, let's cancel. Click on Edit, Preferences, File Handling, or Photoshop Preferences File Handling on a Mac. Then click the checkbox for Enable Legacy Save As. Click OK. Now when we click File, Save As, and click the Save As Type drop-down, we have many more options. I'm going to select JPEG. Here I would change the file name to distinguish it from the original, perhaps adding -adjusted, then save the file to your desired photo location. You're likely to see this JPEG options window come up. If you move this slider to the left, you'll have a lower quality file, but much smaller. Moving it to the right, you'll have a higher quality file and a bit larger. I would stick with a quality around 10. This will provide a quality image while still being much smaller than a RAW file or a Photoshop file. Click OK. And that's it. You've successfully opened a photo, cropped and straightened it, adjusted the color and lighting, removed some spots, and saved the file with a new name. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button. Also, subscribe to my channel to see more videos on photography and photo editing. You might want to check out this video, which uses the same photo and shows you how to blur the background without blurring the subject. And Introduction to Photoshop Lesson 2 will be coming soon, so watch for that. And with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.